folks doing? I have difficult conversations for a living. Every day I talk about diversity and inclusion, which are topics that are difficult for some, bias, microaggressions, bystander intervention, sexual assault, and relationship violence. And these are things that can be tough. So for the time that I have you, I want to give you the heads up that almost everything that I say might be triggering for some. And so if you need to step out of the room, it's okay. Trigger warnings are important so that you know that the information you're about to take in could be something that is triggering to you. And so there are resources available right here should you need them. So what's the issue? College-age women, 18 to 24 years old, whether in college or not, are experiencing sexual assaults at an elevated rate. Young men are also experiencing these assaults. And the more that we see that people are going through this, the more we realize that it's a long-standing epidemic that has to come to an end. What do we do about it here on campus? Well, what we do is we jam as much information as we can into new student orientation. We talk to new students as soon as they get here, including our transfer students, and we have discussions with them about some pretty heavy topics, such as alcohol and drugs, hazing, bystander intervention, sexual violence. And I mean, as we talk to them, it's painful to watch as their heads hit the desk because they're falling asleep from how much we're trying to tell them in one day, sometimes two. But one of the things that we really stress is this topic of consent. And so we bring them on campus and we're trying to talk to them about consent, and we go into this in great detail, even though there may only be a few bullets here. We talk to them about consent being something that's obtained through mutually understandable words and or actions, that consent should be present from beginning to end, that the initiator of sexual contact is the one who's responsible for gaining consent. We talk to them about the fact that consent should be voluntary. It shouldn't be coerced. It shouldn't be forced. It's something that I'm amazed I have to say to people, hey, you shouldn't have sex with people when they're asleep or passed out, when they're experiencing a medical emergency. And yet, I have to have these conversations all too often. And not only do we have to have these conversations, but we have to have a system in place to hold people accountable when these things happen. And so we use different videos and many things to try to stress this point of consent. So if we do all of this, you might be wondering, well, then what's the issue? So I want to share with you one of the situations that I worked through pretty early in my career that forever changed the way that I do my work. It was opening weekend, and a young woman went out with her friends. They went to a party, and they all had a lot to drink that night. And later on, the friends told me that she had had quite a bit, and they could tell early on that she was ill from the alcohol. While they were at the party, they met a high school student. He was on campus visiting, and he decided to hang out with them for the night. As the evening went on, they decided they needed to go back to the residence hall. So they went back to the hall, and what they did was went to her room and said she needs to sleep off this alcohol. And so they all decided to go to another room in the residence hall. But that high school student stayed behind. As the friends left, they all worried about the fact that he was staying in the room. They pondered over what to do, but none of them knew what to do. And so they didn't do anything. The next morning, someone came to the room, and they found her in the room covered in blood. She had been raped, and she was unconscious the entire time this happened. There were a lot of things that bothered me about this. So many things that were concerning as I worked through it. The first was, of course, being sure that she had the resources that she needed, reassuring her that this was not her fault. After that, I started working with over a dozen bystanders who could have done something that night to intervene, but they didn't know how. This is actually what drove my passion for training on bystander intervention. But what I remember most is what she said to me. When I met with her, she looked me in my eyes and she said, I remember everything that you told me at orientation about consent. And I thought that if I did not give someone consent, that they should not feel that they could have sex with me. And while what she said should have been true, it was not. And it made me realize that there were two things that I was not telling students that I really needed to. One is that just because we do education on consent doesn't mean that everybody will understand it. But sometimes we make them think that if people understand consent, that sexual assaults won't happen. And this is false. The second thing is that sometimes people hurt people intentionally. And for that reason, consent education alone is not enough. So what should we be doing? In the scenario that I just gave you, there were two things that were going on, right? One was that they were out and they were having a good time, and she thought that she understood consent. But the X factor there was that the high school student had not been exposed to this level of education that she and other college and university students had. So what would happen if we taught them sooner how to have conversations about consent? Because if you don't talk about consent and don't help people understand that sex without consent is rape, then we really don't have a chance to shift the culture. So one thing I can tell you is that students aren't starting to have sex when they get here. It's just not the truth. Maybe not all students are having sex before they come to college, maybe not even the majority, but enough that when we start to have the conversations with them here, we're trying to change some pretty bad habits that have already formed around talking to your partner about consent. Studies have shown that students have started to have sex as early as the age of 15. That 62% of boys who were surveyed had had sex by the time they were 18, 70% of girls. Studies have also shown that 89% of people really agree that comprehensive sex education is important, though consent is not a part of that education for the most part. And only 35% of you are still listening to me right now. Okay, I was just checking. All right. So what do we need to do? Well, the idea is, what would happen if student affairs professionals such as myself would partner up with our local teachers in the community and go into the schools to start to teach high school students about consent? How could this partnership work? Well, we would develop the curriculum, right? And so the high school teachers would need to take care of permission slips. They would need to take care of the time, place, and manner to give us the space to come into the school to start to have these discussions. While we could come in with an example of ways that we can talk to students about consent, something age appropriate for 11th or 12th graders. We could also offer the assessment. We could be sure that we're talking to them and doing research on, are they learning? And is it later on impacting college and university campuses? We could also partner to train the teachers on these discussions so that the partnership could end if anybody desires for that to happen. So let me give you an example of what that could look like. Most of you are familiar with ride-sharing apps. I won't name any, but you're familiar with how to use a ride-sharing app. So something we could do in the classroom is go in and talk about a ride-sharing app and how this is similar to consent. So with the app, you go in and one person initiates contact. They set a destination, and then the driver agrees for the time that they're going to share together to get them to that destination. If you have a good driver, when they arrive, they're going to ask, is this where you're going? Is this where I'm taking you? You can have a discussion about that. A really good driver might even say to you, is there a certain way that you want me to get you to your destination? Or is it okay for me to take you the way that I know how? While you're on this ride, if you decide that you're just not feeling your driver, you have the right to say, hey, can you pull over and let me out? That driver might confirm that you want to stop the ride, but they're going to stop. And it's okay. The ride ends there, and that's the end of it. Say you fall asleep or you pass out in the vehicle. That driver is going to ask you, are you okay? They're not going to just keep driving to the destination that you agreed to earlier. They're going to say, are you all right? And if you don't answer, or if you say that you're not okay, they're not going to just keep going. They're going to stop and get you help. That's how something like this could work. The reason that something like this could be good with youth is because we know that they don't always talk face to face. Sometimes their communication starts over an app or through text. And so an example like this could show them that even if it was initiated through a text message or through some form of social media, that it's okay to still have these discussions when they get face to face. Additionally, like this situation, the driver is a stranger, and sometimes we know that people don't always know the person that they're hooking up with very well. And so this also demonstrates that even if you're starting this discussion with someone who's a stranger, it's okay to talk about the way that you want to get to your destination. So there are a lot of things that we do to talk about consent on college and university campuses, but this is just one that I came up with to show something that would be age appropriate for college and high school students. The issue is that when they get here to campus, we're really trying to get them to unlearn, and that can be challenging. We have to start to have people talk about consent earlier, understand why consent is important, understand how to obtain consent, and strive for that. Had that high school student had more of those skills, then the scenario I told you earlier may not have happened. So as the saying goes, live we may, but die we must. So while I'm alive, I live to make life better for someone else. If there's anything that we can do to make this world a safer place, I think it's worth pursuing. Thank you.